My pleasure and honor to be here with Rabbi Dr. Dov Weiss, who is the Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Religion at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. You have to check out his most recent book, Pious Irreverence, Confronting God in Rabbinic Judaism. This is a game changer, published by University of Pennsylvania Press, that really challenges a lot of our notions, brings out sources that we've never seen before from the Tanhuma, I believe, mostly, and is just a lovely, intellectually stimulating read. So thanks for taking the time.
Thank you. It's really amazing and an honor to be here. I've heard such wonderful things. I've been following you, been a big fan of yours for so many years. So it's great to actually be here.
Yeah. So there's no one better to actually have a conversation about God than with Dr. Dov Weiss, who puts that at the center of his scholarship. So the first question I want to ask you is, what are the different ways in which Jewish thinkers have conceived of God in Jewish thought? And really over the last 3,000 years.
Yeah. Well, first of all, my studies of the last decade or so, I've come to understand that there are so many different conceptions of God within Jewish thought. Mm-hmm. And when someone says to me, "Do you believe in God?" I say, "Well, which God are you asking me about?" There's the biblical God, there's the rabbinic God, there's the mystical God, the philosophical God, and the Hasidic God.
Right.
And the person typically says, "Okay, maybe we'll talk about this another time."
right.
But it's quite diverse. If you look at the biblical material and the rabbinic material, obviously there's a lot of divergence within these texts. But God is very much a person. God has human-like emotions and feelings.
Body parts,
right? The famous statement by Alon Goshen Gottstein. Famous meaning in academic world,
right.
That there really is no text in rabbinic literature that says that God has no body. That notion that God is incorporeal is really begins with Saadia Gaon and becomes a dogma in Maimonides. Although Philo of Alexandria argued for that 1,000 years earlier, Philo was really not accepted in the Jewish world. So in the Bible and rabbinic literature, God pretty much is a character, right? In rabbinic literature, God becomes even more human-like in the sense that God is weakened in rabbinic literature. There are these many midrashim about how God is in exile with his people, how God suffers with his people. And Michael Fishbane has done a lot of work in highlighting that transformation. In the Bible, God saves or God punishes, but in rabbinic literature, God is crying and weeping with his people. Right? God has his arms kind of enchained behind
like
God's,
a liberation
God's
theology.
back.
Exactly. That's anachronistic.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but that's the image of a God, human-like emotions, human-like limbs, vulnerable in that sense, unpredictable, historical. And what you have in medieval Judaism is a complete revolution. Both medieval philosophy, represented most starkly by Maimonides. Maimonides, who lived in the 12th century, did most of his writings in Egypt. Maimonides, of course, and I'll get to the mystical part in a minute.
Oh, sorry, just before medievals, how about with Chazal?
Well, I would call Chazal, in the academic world, we call Chazal pretty much rabbinic.
Oh, you're already dealing with rabbinic. Okay. And
so when I say rabbinic, I basically mean the writings of the Talmudic rabbis and the rabbis in Midrash.
And is the biggest influence there, external influence, Zoroastrianism, or what are some of the other influences?
Well, I think there is an influence on the Babylonian Talmud. That's the Zoroastrian influence, and there's a lot of scholars that have written about this recently. Two close friends of mine, Yishai Kiel and Shai Sekunda, have done great work highlighting the influence of Zoroastrianism on Judaism, of the Talmudic Judaism, of the Babylonian Talmud. But of course, there's a Jerusalem Talmud that had very little contact with Zoroastrianism. But Midrash in general, almost all of Midrash was produced in the land of Israel. So I think there's not so much of an influence there from Zoroastrianism, but clearly Christianity had a profound influence on rabbinic Judaism, beginning with the Christianization of the Roman Empire and then the Byzantine Empire. So certainly Christianity may have influenced this rabbinic conception of a suffering God, right? Of Imo Nochi Bitzara. But Bible and rabbinics, God is anthropomorphic. personality, character. When you get to the medieval Jewish philosophers, under the influence of Islamic philosophy, or really beginning with Aristotelian philosophy, it's filtered through Arabic translations and commentaries, which Maimonides is reading, you have a philosophical God. You have the God of Aristotle, who's no longer a character. God is a concept. God is a prime mover, the unmoved mover, the first cause. God is intellect. Right? Aristotle had this conception that God is intellect, thinking intellect, so God thinks about himself. God is removed from the world. God is transcendent. God doesn't know the particulars of this world, because if God would, then God would be changing, and God can't change. God is perfect. Maimonides also was influenced by another thinker who began what we refer to as Neoplatonism. It's a certain mystical reading of Plato. Plotinus, who lived in Alexandria in the first few centuries of the Common Era, who developed this idea that God is unknown, that we can't ultimately know God. So I think Maimonides is trying to really kind of grapple with bringing together both Plotinus and Aristotle, because he was under the impression that some of the writings of Plotinus was actually by Aristotle, because Plotinus's works went by the theology of Aristotle, his book, the Aeneid. So Maimonides came up with a real different conception of God, where God was depersonalized, where God is a concept and a character, God is transcendent. So Maimonides then had to reread the entire canon of Judaism, where God is described as having human-like limbs and human-like emotions as metaphorical. Yeah. Or other philosophers will say, well, when there's a description about God in rabbinic literature, where God suffers or God, is seen by prophets, that's not God. That's a divinely created entity that represents God. Whether it's called the Shekhinah or the Kavod. But it's a very different conception of God, and as we'll talk about in a minute, that also influences the description of what idolatry means to him. But that's the philosophical God. Then we get to the Kabbalistic God, also revolutionary concept, that God also is not a person anymore, but God is made up of 10 different powers or entities, or sphirot, that operate according to a certain mechanical-like method where God is no longer a character in history, but God is this system or machine that operates according to law-like necessity. So it's really the fragmentation of the divine personality. If anything, there's a family. God is now family, right? So within God, there is the father, Chachma, or the mother, Bina, the daughter, Shekhinah, the son is Tiferet. So you have a very, very different...
what does that emerge from? What's the external influence there?
Well, the external influence there is probably Christianity. This idea that God is really a divinity made up of a number of different parts that can be described as a family. I think certainly as a Christian influence. And it's not coincidental that Christianity picks up Kabbalah and really claims it for themselves. You have these great Christian thinkers who argued that Kabbalah really represents ultimately the truths of Christianity. Whether it be Abner of Burgos or Pico della Mirandola, you have a lot of these. The whole Christian Kabbalah begins. On the philosophical part with Maimonides, I think I mentioned that's mostly Islamic influence.
Right.
So I think you clearly, and I'll talk about and maybe a little bit, if we have time, talk about how different notions of monotheism, I think, also played. And the last conception I've got, I would say, is the Hasidic conception, which you can't lump all Hasidism into one view, but certainly there's one strand, beginning with Baal HaTanya, the great first rabbi of Chabad, who basically says, no, everything is God. That there is no differentiation between the material world and the spiritual world. So that I would call monism. That ultimately everything is God if you have the right perspective. So this bench you think is really wood, but it's actually pulsating with divine energy.
So how is it differentiated from Spinoza? I mean, for him, he's alienated and ostracized for a form of pantheism, whereas builds Chabad movement.
That's a good question. Whether there are parallels between Spinoza and Hasidism. My area is not modern Jewish thought, so I certainly would know where to look, but I think that there's work and scholarship to be done. I think on parallels between Spinoza and Hasidism.
So in these five different camps, which biblical, rabbinic, I think medieval.
Right, medieval's broken down into medieval philosophical and medieval and medieval mystic, medieval Kabbalistic, and then Hasidism in the modern period, which is 18th, 19th century.
Okay, and then the modern, but then looking at contemporary times, and again, it's not your primary scholarship. Is there new emergence of new conceptions as well, or do you think they still fall into those five categories more or less?
There probably are. I'm just not an expert in like the last 100. I mean, I'm sure you can add Buber and Rosenzweig. I'm sure you can add more conceptions. I'm just not as comfortable.
So how would those different five conceptualizations view the concept of monotheism differently?
So very differently. So in the biblical material, many scholars have actually argued that the notion of monotheism originally with the ancient Israelites began as not monotheism but monolatry, which means that there was an acceptance of multiple gods within ancient Israel. The requirement was to worship one of them. Right? So Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. Not the Lord is one, but the Lord only. Meaning we are required only to worship Adonai. As opposed to all the other gods.
And they're equals to some degree.
Well, they may not be equal, but there is recognition that they're gods. They're many gods. Lo yehel elohim achirim al panai. Meaning you shall not worship other gods. There is no statement within the Ten Commandments of there is no other God.
But there's real kochot, there's real energy and power.
Exactly, there is real power.
Paro is accessing.
Exactly. What happens in the later biblical material, beginning with Isaiah, chapter 40 to 56 in Isaiah, as well as in Deuteronomy, you have more of a radical, what scholars would call radical monotheism, where there is only one God. So that's very simple. I think, and this fits well with the rabbinic period as well. In the Bible and rabbinic period, the idea that monotheism means there is only one God in the world, right? Rejecting this old Israelite idea of monolatry. That's simple. There's one God. There's one Dov Weiss who was born May 25th. I'm not going to mention the year, in Riverdale. There's just one of me. What happens with Maimonides is that monotheism becomes, it's not only there is one God in the world, but God is oneness. Internally.
When does that emerge, did you say?
Well, I think it begins already in the writings of Saadia Gaon. But I think Maimonides makes it more popular and makes it into a real dogma where if you don't believe his definition of monotheism, then you're a heresy. God for Maimonides can't have parts. It's not that there is only one God to worship. That God, there is no division within that God. And if you believe there are divisions within God, that's heresy. So if you believe God has body, that's heresy. Because to have body means it could be sliced in half. Right? So for Maimonides, when the Shema says that God is one, it doesn't mean there's one God. It means that God is oneness. God can't be differentiated. There are no parts, right? And therefore, God, in some sense, is really unknown because there can't be any parts. And idolatry is to believe otherwise. In the Kabbalistic view, monotheism doesn't mean there is one God or God is oneness. But what it means is exactly the opposite. That there is a multiplicity of divine powers, but monotheism means is that they're ultimately all connected to each other. It's that the divine realm is not separate, right? That Metatron is not separated from divinity, right? Metatron is divine. The point being is that it's about unity. And so Shema is not a statement that God is one, but it's a statement that, in a certain sense, God needs to become one. That we, through our mitzvot, we bring together.
It's aspirational.
Jews can maintain the unity within the divine realm by doing acts of mitzvot, by doing religious deeds. We can unify God.
Like in a sense of theurgy, also.
In a sense of theurgy, right? So for the Kabbalists, they would look at the Maimonides and other Jewish philosophers as championing an Aristotelian point of view, an Aristotelian conception of God. For them, God is not oneness. Maybe that's the ultimate, the Ein Sof. The Kabbalists do have the sense of the undifferentiated aspect of God, the Ein Sof. But there's also divinity that is emanating from this original undifferentiated oneness of Ein Sof, and that there are multiplicity of parts to it. So what is idolatry? In the Kabbalistic point of view, is when, let's say, you pray to only one of the Sfirot. That's heresy, right. Because you're dividing. You're seeing, let's say, Shekhinah, one of the 10 Sfirot, as being separate from the other 9 Sfirot. It's a very, very different.
So you've started going there. Maybe you could flesh out a little bit more of the historical and theological implications of these different versions of monotheism. So you've just started talking about Avodah Zarah as one of them.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So in terms of idolatry. Yeah. So in the biblical and rabbinic period, idolatry means when you're not serving that one God, when you're serving other gods. Right. So the problem is you're worshiping other gods. For Maimonides, the problem is not worshiping other gods. The problem is when you have a wrong mental conception of the right God,
praxis
of the right
belief.
God. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Maimonides is always heresy now becomes a mental conception, and heresy is happening in shul. Right. When you're praying to God, you just have this conception that God has body.
Which is already difficult. How can you command belief or emotion? That's a whole other conversation. But the fact that he believes that that's something that could even be controlled to some degree.
Right. Yeah. That's certainly difficult. Yeah. But so for Maimonides, this idea that idolatry in his day is the idolatry of believing in the literalness of the Bible, right? So if you read, Bible comes from Maimonides a very dangerous document, because if you believe that God gets jealous, that's heresy. That's idolatry for Maimonides, right? If you believe that God is not oneness in the Neoplatonic philosophical sense, that's heresy, right? And for the Kabbalists, if you don't believe in their system of the 10 Sfirot, right? For them, that would be heresy as well. So, a lot of these conceptions are mutually, exclusive, right? And then, of course, the Hasidic point of view, and here I'm thinking of Shner Zalman of Liadeh, of the first Chabad rabbi. For him, monotheism is not that there's one God. It's not the oneness of God, that God has no parts. It's not the bringing together of the unity of the divine Sfirot. What monotheism means is monism, the belief that everything is God. Right. So if you believe that somehow there's a transcendent God, right, that is out there, and there's the world here, the material world, and there's the spiritual world out there, that for, let's say, Chabad theosophy is heresy, because everything is divine. This desk is divine, and so my point is that Chabad, would look at. If you ask me, Chabad is ultimately diametrically opposed to the Maimonidean understanding. Now, of course, they wouldn't admit this, right? Because they would look back at the tradition and somehow fit, their theories and perspectives back onto earlier texts.
So, people talk about Judaism as if it's this ethical monotheism. If you committed to that in some broad sense, we're all kind of on the same page. And certainly ethics is complex, but even this monotheism bit has such a range. So and some, as you've already pointed out, some of these conceptions are mutually exclusive. So what does that mean about what Judaism is? To say that our very conception of God, which feels the most fundamental aspect of what Judaism is about, is actually radically split.
So I would say there is no such thing as Judaism. That there are many Judaisms, because these differences aren't just peripheral. I mean, these differences are fundamental. They go to the heart of Judaism. How do you read that phrase in Deuteronomy chapter 6? Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, right? Such vastly different ways. I mean, for a certain strand of Hasidic Judaism, Shema is a statement that the world and God is all one. And for the Kabbalists, it's about the realm of the Sfirot. And so my perspective on it is that Judaism is an evolving religious tradition, and it's not static, and it's a historical religion. And like all religions, there are many different voices, and these voices are often fundamentally opposed to other voices within the tradition. These voices were motivated by obviously different factors, certainly the cultural, historical context being one of them. But ultimately then what, and here of course I'm drawing from Mordechai Kaplan, is I think what brings it all together, right? And we call it Judaism, is language and form. You know, we're all committed to the words Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. What that means, the content, that could be almost anything.
Yeah.
What brings us together is form, not content. It's about language and not meaning. And I didn't realize this before I came to graduate school. And for me, it's very, very exciting because it really speaks to the openness of our tradition.
And I think from that openness, it can open up new avenues of not just tolerance and inclusivity, but epistemic pluralism, to understand this notion of multiple truths, potentially, or at least an appreciation for where others are coming from, and intellectually and spiritual creativity. For folks to actually discover the models that work for them and understand that one of the gifts of Judaism, as you're laying out, is that a lot of people can fit in engaging with the Judaisms, the different models that have been offered.
Exactly. It allows us so many different entry points.
Right.
You know, whether you believe in a personal God, you don't believe in a personal God.
Yeah.
You know, it allows for so many people to enter. But I think what is clear to me in my studies is that this position that's been promulgated within centrist orthodoxy, that there's some unadulterated, Masorah, or there's one tradition, not with respect to fundamental questions, but even with respect to small details of law, as if there was one tradition, I just think is just intellectually unappealing, and it just, for me at least, is vacuous. From an intellectual
and I think actually we pushed many people away from engagement with Jewish life because we've told them that this is actually quite simple, and it's authoritarian, and this is it's actually. And
let's not be afraid of the fact that Judaism has a history to it, and that Judaism is a tradition that records voices of human beings seeking God.
This is the scholar you want to follow. If you haven't yet read Pious Irreverence, Confronting God in Rabbinic Judaism, it will rock your world. It's crucial. It's been crucial for me, and continue to follow the wonderful teachings.
And thank you for your review of the book.
Wow, it was a great zchut. It was a great zchut. Thank you so much.